says in Romans 3, what then? Are we better than they? Jews better than Gentiles? No. No and no wise. We've before proved both Jews and Gentiles that they're all under sin. So Jews and Gentiles means that God's going to save sinners. And here he says that he's going to save Jews and Gentiles. That's a scope of God's salvation. It's much broader than anyone ever imagined. We always thought God was so restrictive and narrow. No, it's way wider than you imagine. He told Nicodemus, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Not every individual, but much broader than you ever thought possible. And I think that's the scope or the breadth of God's love. That's one aspect to it, isn't it? That God would save even those who were not his people. He would call them my people. And to a nation that was not called by my name, he would say, behold me. Behold me. And he says, look unto me, all the ends of the earth, and be ye saved. That's the breadth, that's the scope of it all, you see. And then also the depth of God's love. The depth of God's love. And how deep, how far did God go? Well, he took us all the way in Ephesians 2 from being dead in sins. When we were the enemies of God, it says, even when we were enemies, God, he raised us up and made us sit together in heavenly places with Christ. According to his mercy, he did that. So that's the depth, that God would reach to the depth of our condition. And how high? How high does it go? It goes all the way to heaven itself. That God would raise us up from that condition of sin and depravity and death and separation from God, all the way to make us heirs and joint heirs with Jesus Christ, so that we lack nothing that's his. That's how far up. That's the height. The breadth, the length, the height, and what else is there? Well, there's the eternality of God's love, that it went all the way back from eternity past and all the way forward. All these things are encompassed in these four things and more, I'm sure. And the fact that God gave his Son, the fact that God gave his Son and did not spare him, and that Christ gave himself for his people, all that's meant by these phrases, to know the love of Christ, which passes knowledge. But at the end of the day, though, it's infinite in every direction. We cannot understand, really, the scope of God's love. But now these are the things that Paul prays according to God's Spirit. And when God's Spirit pens these things for us, he's revealing his love for his people. But I want to take you to Hebrews now, Hebrews chapter 8, because the question is, what has God showed us of his things? And this is something, like I said, it's not a maybe-so thing. This is what he said he would do. It's something he promised, something he will do, and he will do it for all his people. Look at Hebrews chapter 8. In Hebrews 8, there's a repetition of a promise from Jeremiah, and it's repeated again in Hebrews 10. It starts in verse 10. Actually, let me pick it up in verse 9 of Hebrews 8. He says, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. I'm not going to make a covenant like I made with them then. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind, and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least to the greatest. For, now the next verse, I want to emphasize this. The word for there is really an explanation of what he had just said, that they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord. Okay, in what way then does the Spirit of God teach every one of his people so that they know something? This is what he teaches them. Verse 12, I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. Has God taught you that? If God has taught you that, then it's the work of the Spirit of God. And I can say that God has taught me that. God has taught me that he has been merciful to my unrighteousness. and that according to Christ's sacrifice, he has remembered my sins no more. Not according to anything in me, but according to what he has done. Are these not the things of Christ? Isn't the forgiveness, isn't the redemption that he worked out, the redemption, a thing of his? Doesn't that belong to him? Didn't he obtain that when he offered himself in Hebrews chapter 9? Did not he obtain eternal redemption for us? He offered himself and obtained it. Now that's his. And now he shows it to us because he's made it ours. And he doesn't just show it to us in kind of a vague way. He embeds it into our inmost being that we have been forgiven for his name's sake. That we can say with the thief on the cross, remember me, Lord, when you come into your kingdom. And know that he will remember us because he remembered us before we even knew him. He knew us before we knew him. He says in Jeremiah 31:3, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. With an everlasting love. In fact, there's another place I love this, and just because maybe it's one of my favorites, let me take you to it in Isaiah 38. Isaiah 38, remember Hezekiah, he was about to die. God had afflicted him with something, and he said, Isaiah came to him, and he said, you're going to die, get ready to die. And Hezekiah went into conniptions. He just started whining and crying and everything. But anyway, it wasn't bad. It was actually good, because listen to what he prays in Isaiah 38. He says, let me look at verse 14. This is Hezekiah. He says, in fact, I'll pick up at verse 9. This is off topic, but let me read it anyway. The writings of Hezekiah, king of Judah, when he had been sick and was recovered of his sickness, this is what he says. I said, in the cutting off of my days, I shall go to the gates of the grave. I am deprived of the residue of my years. I said, I shall not see the Lord, even the Lord in the land of the living. I shall behold man no more with the inhabitants of the world. Mine age is departed, and is removed from me as a shepherd's tent. I have cut off like a weaver my life. He will cut me off with pining sickness. From day to day, even to night, wilt thou make an end of me. I reckon till morning, that as a lion, so will he break all my bones. From day even to night wilt thou make an end of me. Like a crane or a swallow, so did I chatter. I did mourn as a dove. Mine eyes fail with looking upward. O Lord, I am oppressed. Undertake for me. What shall I say? He hath both spoken unto me, and himself hath done it. I shall go softly all my years in the bitterness of my soul. O Lord, by these things men live, and in all these things is the life of my spirit. So wilt thou recover me and make me to live. And now here's the verse I love. Listen to this, verse 17. Behold, for peace I had great bitterness, but thou hast in love to my soul delivered it from the pit of corruption, for thou hast cast all my sins behind thy back. For the grave cannot praise thee, death cannot celebrate thee. They that go down into the pit cannot hope for thy truth. The living, he shall praise thee as I do this day. The father to the children shall make known thy truth. And so what was Hezekiah's consolation? Was that God had saved him from the pit of corruption, from the pit of hell, really. Why? Because he had loved his soul and had forgiven him all his transgressions. That's the same thing that God taught us. That's the same thing he promised to teach us in Hebrews 8. And those are the things of Christ, that he would so teach us. Whose salvation is this? Remember, salvation is of the Lord, and it's God's salvation. The salvation that God has given to us is the things of Christ. He's made it known to us, and he shows it to us. So now let's go on. And I know that we had gone over that verse before, but I wanted to cover that and didn't want to let that slip by as we went through this. Now, look at chapter 16, verse 16. I want to talk about the two littles. This is what Christ says here in John 16.